Welcome to this week's episode of Stranger Stitches. We're going to take a candle into the darkest corners of history and the tragedies of true crime, and I'm going to sprinkle in just enough sweet tea and southern charm to keep it all very civilized. So, don't worry, y'all. This story is compiled from public sources and not intended as a news article. I've included oral histories from the communities and a bit of the neighborhood gossip when it was available. I do loves me a good chin wag. So pick your poison, sit that shapely ass down, and buckle up, Buttercup. Today we are diving into that batshit crazy tale of the Plainfield Butcher. That's right, y'all. We are talking about Ed Gein, a man who took mommy issues and gave it its own zip code. Let's begin at the begin. Ed's daddy George and Mama Augusta tied the knot in 1900 in Hamburg, Wisconsin. Now that's about 153 miles from La Crosse, where Augusta lived. Back in those days, that was like traveling to the moon. I'm wondering how these two lovebirds even met, seeing that this was way before Tinder and OkCupid. That's a mighty long way to travel for a first date. And maybe it was one of those arranged situations, keeping like-minded families together. And stranger things have happened. Augusta was the kind of fanatically religious woman who could thump a Bible or thump you with it. Now, don't get me wrong, I appreciate those with the devotion to their faith, but this lady took it over the cuckoo's nest. She was raised in a family of German old Lutherans, and bless them for it, where they believed that every single human in thought and deed was dipped in sin from day one, and she passed this delightful worldview on to her boys. Like it was a family heirloom, she taught Ed and Henry that sex was evil and that women were basically Satan's little helpers, excluding herself. Of course, Mama was a pious woman and always knew best, and except for growing the family, there was no reason for any naked shenanigans. How convenient for her, because she didn't like her husband anyway. Augusta made both her sons promise to always remain virgins. She had daily Bible readings, but Augusta didn't focus on those sweet uplifting verses about love and forgiveness. Oh, no. She would read to Ed and his brother from the dark corners of Scripture, dwelling on Old Testament passages dripping with the wrath of God. And she also loved to read from the book of Revelation, where there were promises of apocalyptic doom. One of her favorite bedtime stories wasn't about Jesus blessing children. They was about Cain slaying Abel, and the flood that drowned every living thing, and the plagues that turned the rivers into blood. All delivered with the conviction of someone who truly believed every word, and this was meant specifically to educate her sons. Well, and if Mama said it came from the good book, well, it must be gospel truth. Ed was the baby of the family, with his big brother Henry was 5 years older. Now, George Gein was what we would politely call a hot mess. He was an abusive drunk who dabbled in carpentry, tanning, and farming when the mood struck him. More often than not, George was sitting pretty, unemployed, on the sofa, being a complete embarrassment to his wife, bless his little pickled heart. Augusta wanted a daughter, and she decided to endure the inconvenience of conceiving baby number 2. She was disappointed as all get out when little Ed came along, and she wasn't shy about letting him know, because nothing says maternal love like making your child feel like a consolation prize. Well, Augusta is the one that supported the family through a fairly successful grocery business. It started out with George running the show, but I don't have to tell you how that worked out. So she took over the business and knew that she could do a much better job anyway. She despised George, felt he was worthless, well, because he pretty much was, and gave him no part, none, in raising the boys, telling just about anyone could hear, and I don't imagine anyone wanted to hear it, that George was worthless and a very sorry excuse for a human being, and that he was certainly bound for hell. In 1914, the Geins moved to Plainfield, Wisconsin, to a working farm because Augusta wanted to move her family away from the immorality of the city and the sinners that inhabited it. to become the center of their universe and to make them totally dependent on her. The closest neighbors were almost a mile away. Ed and Henry began school at Rocha Cree Grade School. It was a tiny one-room building with only 12 students. So our Ed was an average student at school, but he was an excellent reader and continued to be an avid reader his entire life. They were only allowed off the farm long enough to attend school and go straight home. No extracurriculars before or after, and certainly no playing with the other children. Ed was shunned and isolated at school because of his lazy eye and his shyness. He also had something wrong with his tongue that made him speak a little weird. Augusta severely punished the boys. When they did attempt to make friends, she would always find something wrong with any kid that came around and then run them off. That didn't go far towards their popularity at school. Augusta verbally abused the boys and said that with any distraction, they would become failures like their father. Ed would come home crying from kids making fun of him and his alcoholic father and his weird family. Now, this was the only part that George was allowed to have in child rearing. He would repeatedly beat Ed in the head until his ears started ringing, just as Augusta commanded. So traumatic brain injury was a good possibility. Of course, he was never treated for anything like that. If there were any symptoms, of course Augusta would have kept it in-house. When Ed was a young boy, he was prohibited from entering the slaughterhouse on the farm. And what's the best way to get a kid to do something, tell them they can't? All right, well, you know what happened. He decided to sneak in one day and take a peek, only to witness his mother slaughtering a pig. Instead of being horrified, as I might think would be the usual response of a child, Ed found the act arousing. He got so excited that he got happy in his pants. While one can suppose what caused this excitement, but it would be, for me, a choice between seeing the blood and gore or seeing his mama holding the knife. When Ed was around 12 or 13, he was caught by his mother spanking the monkey in the bathtub. She grabbed his genitals and called them the curse of man. Now, I got a couple of questions around that, too. What was Augusta doing walking in the bathroom on a teenager taking a bath? That could have, yeah. I'm just going to move on. At 14, Ed graduated from the 8th grade and dropped out of school, never looked back. Higher learning was not going to be a thing for him, though he did keep reading. Always loved his books. George, Ed's father, became a helpless invalid and was completely dependent on his family. Yet the family that feared and hated him. Now, picture this pathetic scene. A man who'd spent years terrorizing his family was now reduced to a shell of himself. No help whatsoever on the farm, still drinking away the little bit of money they had, and the very sight of him made Augusta's skin crawl. On April 1st, 1940, now isn't this date just perfect for what might have been the ultimate April Fool's joke? George died of what they called pneumatic fluid on the lungs at age 66. Now, Augusta, being the loving wife she was, attributed his death to weakness, physical and moral, and made sure to remind everyone who'd listen that he was surely burning in hell for eternity. Ain't she a sweetheart? Well, things get a little more interesting, and I feel something else was going on here. Was this really just a convenient natural death, or was dear old Dad Ed's first victim? Now think about it. George was causing Mama problems, making her life miserable, and we all know how Ed feels about his Mama. Anything that was going to upset his precious Augusta. When you're that devoted to your mother and Daddy's being a thorn in her side, well, sometimes problems just need to disappear, don't they? That timing was awful convenient, and be honest, who's going to question the death of a sickly drunk, especially when his devoted son was there to care for him in his final moments? Makes you wonder what really happened in that farmhouse, don't it? Well, Ed and Henry then began taking on odd jobs around the town to help support the family and the farm, and they worked mostly as handymen. Ed was often employed as a babysitter. Ooh, that's shiversome. But I think the kids were probably a little out of his demographic, so that was probably okay. He loved the company of children because they were much easier to relate to. Both Ed and Henry were considered very trustworthy and reliable by the townspeople. One said, if you paid them $1, you got $1.10 worth of work. And that's a nice thing to say about your handyman. At this time, Ed was still eligible for the draft and had to travel to Milwaukee to take a physical exam. He was rejected due to the lazy eye, which slightly impaired his vision, and a little bit of speech impediment. But here's what I think. I think Ed is what I refer to as an FLP. That is not a military designation. It stands for funny little person. Nothing specific you can put your finger on, but, just funny. And the eyelid probably wasn't the only reason, but it was just a polite no thank you, go home. I think they got a look at him and realized he was not military personnel. But this was the furthest from home he had ever been, and the only time in his life he would travel so far, except when the family moved him as a child, and he probably had no recollection of that, and he never had the urge to get very far from Mama. So I've got a scandal for you. And if you are triggered by animal abuse, it might be good to turn away for about 15 seconds. So here's a charming little tale that really shows Augusta's stellar priorities. Sometime in 1945, as Ed himself recounted, he and his saintly mother took a little field trip to visit a man named Smith who lived on a farm nearby, where they were to purchase straw because even a psychopath cares for their farm animals. Well, wouldn't you know? They had arrived just in time for the neighborhood horror show. According to Ed, he and Augusta witnessed Smith beating a dog while a woman inside the Smith residence came running outside, hollering for him to stop. But did Smith listen? Oh, no. He beat that poor animal to death right there in front of God and everybody. Augusta was extremely upset by this scene. And while I was doing the research for this, I thought she might be showing just a spark of humanity, but no. I mean, she was extremely upset because what bothered this pillar of Christian virtue wasn't the fact that an innocent animal was murdered in front of her eyes. No, that was apparently just a typical Tuesday on the Smith farm. What really got her church lady panties in a twist was the presence of that woman. You see, Augusta's keen moral radar had detected that this woman wasn't married to Mr. Smith and therefore had absolutely no business being there. So there's Augusta, witnessing violence against a helpless creature, and her biggest concern is clutching her pearls over someone's living arrangements. She angrily called that woman Smith's harlot, because apparently in Augusta's world, unmarried cohabitation is far greater sin than beating an animal to death. Just your typical wholesome family outing, folks. Nothing says quality mother-son bonding time like a good old-fashioned display of misplaced moral outrage. She gave Ed the morality lecture all the way home. And just to show Mr. Smith how serious they were, neither herself or Ed ever did business with them again. Henry did not share Ed's worship of their mother and began to openly criticize her. Henry had memories of the outside world and knew that Mama wasn't right. Henry was worried about what he perceived to be Ed's unhealthy attachment to their mother and worried about what would happen if he left. Henry had begun dating a divorced mother of two and planned to move in with her. He worried so much about Ed, and he often spoke ill of Augusta around Ed, who responded, he was shocked and hurt. He just couldn't believe it. Augusta would have shit a kitten if she knew about Henry's plan. Henry felt that Ed had a sexual and romantic attraction to their mother, and that worried him greatly. And the family's isolation on the farm only grew his dependence on her and his attraction to her. The fact that she had hated her husband had made her also more reliant on her sons for any sort of companionship. So, as she wished, when she moved out there, she was nurturing the dependency by her sons. Ed was just straight up mortified, but let me tell you what happened. Henry died a sudden death under mysterious circumstances at the age of 43, while he and Ed were fighting a runaway fire in the marshland near their home. And ain't that a coincidence? Are we seeing a pattern here? If you don't like Mama, he don't like you. And that's a very dangerous position to be in when you're alone with Ed. Here's the details of what happened. On a day in May 1944, the fire started on the Gein property. Dry brush, dead grass, something that burns easily. Controlled burns weren't uncommon for farmers trying to clear their land, but this one went faster than church gossip. It got close to some nearby timber, and Ed and Henry grabbed whatever tools they could find, shovels and rakes, wet burlap sacks, and headed out to fight the blaze before it could reach the house or the barn. The smoke was thick. You could hardly see more than a few yards in any direction. The heat was fierce. The crackling roar of the fire would have drowned out just about any sound a man might make if he was in trouble. The fire department and the sheriff saw that column of smoke rising like incense to heaven on the Gein farm, and they went to check it out. Well, they helped put the fire out, and all was well. Well, almost all was well. Ed reported that he had been unable to locate Henry during all the chaos and confusion, claiming his brother had gotten separated from him somewhere in all that smoke. But here's where things get suspicious. When the search party formed to look for poor Henry, Ed led them straight as an arrow, to exactly where his brother was laying. Ain't that peculiar? A man who claimed he couldn't find his brother and all that knew precisely where to look. So the search party followed Ed directly to the spot where Henry Gein laid sprawled on the ground that the fire had barely touched. His clothes weren't singed. His hair wasn't burned. There wasn't so much as a scorch mark on his body, but he was dead as disco. What Henry did have was a head full of bruises that looked like they'd been made with something falling down on him. Yeah. Well, summing it up, the scene did not make sense. If Henry had died from the fire, where were the burns? If he'd collapsed from the smoke, why were there bruises on his skull like someone had taken a blunt object to him? Well, I think it's mostly because they did, and most puzzling of all was, how did Ed manage to lead that search party directly to his brother's body in an area of marshland that hadn't been touched? Well, the county coroner listed Henry's cause of death as asphyxiation. The police dismissed the notion of foul play because they did not believe that Ed was capable of killing anyone. Augusta took the death pretty hard. Late in 1944, Augusta started getting faint and sickly and having to lay down a lot. Not long after Henry's death, she had to be hospitalized. Augusta had suffered her first stroke. In 1945, Augusta had been bedridden for quite some time and hanging around the house more than she usually did. She got real worried about Ed's reading material. It included things like books on head shrinking, grave robbing, and many books on human anatomy. Also, pulp magazines and adventure stories. He developed a particular interest in these, especially those that featured themes of cannibals and Nazi atrocities. He was fascinated by accounts of the horrors that were committed in concentration camps, and claims circulated about Elise Koch, the wife of the Buchenwald commandant. She had created items from human skin. She was known as the Bitch of Buchenwald. He also had a lot of books on female anatomy, and that became his spank bank. Ugh. I'm just going to step over that. While his interest in reading is well documented, his mother got on to him about it all the time, saying that that was devil stuff, because of course it was, and everything she didn't approve of was devil stuff. Well, he didn't have to worry about it too long. In December of 1945, and I think Ed was about either 39 or 40 by then, Augusta passed away of complications from a second stroke. She was about 67 at that time. Ed reacted to her death by boarding up his mother's room and leaving it sit to be preserved museum style as it had been exactly when she was alive. The rest of the house became a hoarder's paradise, while Augusta's room remained pristine. The next year, Ed's already unkempt appearance degrades even further, and his neighbors comment on how bad he smells. Ed continued to live on the farm and live off meager earnings from odd jobs, and then boarded up the rest of the house, but all but 2 rooms, and they were never opened again until his arrest. 18 months after Augusta died, Ed was driven by intense loneliness, and what he later said to be strange visions, began to visit the cemetery where his mother was buried. After several visits, he began to dig up corpses. The first body he dug up was that of his mother, twisting her head off with his bare hands. Yeah, Ed took the head and shrunk it in the way his book taught him to. Rumors went around. Local teenagers said they reported seeing Ed Gein with what he claimed were shrunken heads, attributing them to relics sent by a cousin who had served in the Philippines, and reported that he had served soup to them out of human skull caps. But the reality was, the police investigation revealed these to be human facial skins, carefully removed from corpses and used by Ed as masks. These masks were part of a larger collection of gruesome items that he had crafted from human remains, including their skulls, bones, and skin. By 1947, things had gotten real dark real fast. An 8-year-old little girl named Georgia Weckler disappeared without a damn trace, leaving no suspects, and the only clue was some tire tracks from a Ford. Now, they knew it was a Ford because the Ford cars came from the factory with a specific kind of tire that was only available from Ford. That's how they knew that. But on Thursday, May 1st, 1947, little Georgia Weckler was given a lift home from grade school in Jefferson, Wisconsin by a neighbor, Mrs. Flork. She dropped that baby off half a mile from her farmhouse. Mrs. Flork watched as the girl paused to open the family mailbox and remove a stack of mail, just like any other day. Being farm acreage, the house proper itself sat half a mile back from the road. Now, this is just a short distance for an energetic young girl. She gave Mrs. Flork a final wave goodbye and went up the lane towards her house and was never seen again. Georgia never made it home. Local lawmen were called and immediately launched an all-night search, which came to nothing. By Friday, hundreds of area residents had joined the hunt, searching 10 square miles of countryside without finding a trace of that missing little girl. Farmers and businessmen from around the county also contributed more than $8,000. Now, that was a lot of money back then, as a reward for information leading to the girl's recovery. Everybody was just desperate to bring her home. And like we talked about earlier, the only clue to her disappearance was a black Ford sedan, which had been seen backing out of the Weckler's lane shortly after Mrs. Flork had dropped Georgia off by the mailbox. Sheriff George Perry of Jefferson had discovered deep ruts in the gravel, clearly caused by the rapid spinning of automobile tires, which suggested that the sedan had been taken off in a hurry, like somebody had business and they didn't want to get caught doing it. On Monday afternoon, George's father, a respected member of the community who had served as the town treasurer, went on the radio and pleaded for his daughter's release. But a week passed without a word from any abductors, and that poor man's heart was breaking right there for everybody to hear. Between 1947 and 1951, during this time, our boy Ed began making nocturnal visits to as many as 40 cemeteries because apparently regular hobbies just weren't cutting it for him. He would frequently leave without committing any offense, but on 9 occasions, that sick little bastard dug up the coffins of the newly buried middle-aged women. He had scouted these women out in obituaries like he was shopping for grocery coupons. He would take what he wanted and then recover the violated graves like nothing ever happened. Now, one would think, because Ed was not a big person, he was like 5'5" and 140, he would have a hard time digging up a grave by himself, but he shopped carefully. These were newly buried people in which the ground had been recently dug up and recently replaced. He didn't wait for the soil to get hard and packed. He was just removing shovels full of loose soil. So that's how he was able to get that deed done by himself. He says that other than masturbation, he never had any sexual experience in his life, but stated also that he would never have sex with the cadavers because they just, his quote, smelled too bad. But considering his own hygiene and the neighbors' reports of his own odor, I doubt that that was the whole truth. He would have been too embarrassed to tell anyone and also didn't want to disrespect his precious mother's teachings. His cravings and compulsions still fall under the category of necrophilia. And that's just a gross word to even say. Necrophilia is explained, in some cases at least, by the simple fact that the dead can't refuse, reject, or resist. Also, they don't tell tales or talk back. And most importantly, Mama would never have to know. An increase in missing persons in the area began around this time as well, and totally had the police stumped. In 1951, Ed dug up Eleanor Adams, sorry about that, Eleanor, a 51-year-old woman who had been buried earlier that day. Fresh ground. Can you even stomach that thought? November 1st, 1952, Victor Bunk Travis, age 42, and his friend Ray Burgess disappeared with their car after spending several hours at a local bar in Plainfield. No one can trace them or their car. None of that was ever found. While kidnapping men was out of character for Gein, police still suspect that he had some role in their disappearance, and honestly, who else would it be? I think maybe he just needed a different car. I don't think Ed was quite as simple as records show him to be. Now, by this time, Ed began receiving a farm subsidy from the federal government. That started in late 1951 because apparently even psychopaths deserve government assistance. He occasionally worked for local municipal road crews and crop threshing crews in the Plainfield area. Sometime between 1946 and 1956, he also sold an 80-acre parcel of land that was to have been Henry's, and as we know, Henry ain't gonna need it no more. Here's another heartbreaking story on October 24th, 1953. Now, if this story don't break your heart, you don't have one. Viggo Rasmussen, a professor at the La Crosse State College, hired Evelyn Hartley, the daughter of a fellow professor, to take care of his 20-month-old daughter. That evening, Evelyn's father, Richard, called the Rasmussen house several times after she failed to check in as planned at 8:30 p.m. When he received no answer, as any concerned daddy would be, he drove over to the Rasmussen's house. When Richard arrived, the doors were locked, the lights and radio were on. Items were scattered all over the house like a tornado came through. The living room furniture had been moved around in different places. You could see by tracks on the floors and the rugs. And there was Evelyn's school book scattered around, too. Richard found her shoes in different rooms, one upstairs, one downstairs, and also found his daughter's broken glasses upstairs. But he didn't find Evelyn. Not in that house or anywhere else. Richard also found every room in the house had been locked, just like at Ed's house, right? Except for one in the basement at the back of the house. An open window was missing a screen, and the screen was found leaning against an outside wall. He also found a short stepladder that belonged to the homeowners, and it was positioned by that open window. Pry marks were found on some windows, and footprints had been found in the area of the house. Blood was found both inside the house and outside in the yard. Bloody handprints on a garage about 100 feet away, and on a nearby house. The child Evelyn had been caring for was found asleep and unharmed, thank you, Lord. Police believe that someone took Evelyn through the yard but dropped her on the ground before carrying her any further. Oh, Ed, being a man of small stature, might have struggled to carry anybody. But the adrenaline might have given him a bump. The police used dogs to pick up her scent trail, which ended at Cooley Drive, just 2 blocks away. Police thought that Evelyn was most likely put into a vehicle there and then driven away. They were told by one neighbor that they had seen a car repeatedly driving around the neighborhood, and another person who lived nearby claimed they had heard screams an hour earlier. The witness thought it was just children playing. That truth must haunt them now. 2 days after the incident, local resident Ed Hoffer told police that while driving his vehicle, he was almost hit by a dark green 2-tone Buick. It is not stated if that was the car that belonged to the other 2 men, but I've got suspicions. Well, this Buick was speeding in a westerly direction. Inside that car, Hoffer reported seeing one man driving the vehicle while a second man was in the back seat with the girl. See, then that kind of throws water on the Ed Gein story because he usually worked alone, but we're never going to know for sure. Hoffer also reported that a few minutes later he had seen the same 2 men with the young girl as he was pulling outside of his brother-in-law's house located around the corner from the Rasmussen house. Hoffer had stated that the girl was wedged between the 2 men and had thought that she was drunk as the 2 men were holding her by the arms as they were walking down the street. That scenario just doesn't add up to me either. But we'll noodle this out. Several days later, various items of clothing, many of which were stained with blood, were found in different locations. Blood found on a jacket matched Evelyn's blood type. And that's where people were kind of figuring that Evelyn wasn't coming home. But they weren't giving up. Over 1,000 members of the local community, including law enforcement officers, the National Guard, Boy Scouts, and La Crosse State College students and faculty, persisted in a search all over the place. The Civil Air Patrol and the U.S. Air Force also came to the search. Vehicle inspection programs were undertaken with the intent of searching every vehicle in La Crosse County. Gas station attendants were to check the cars for bloodstains. Recent graves were reopened to determine if Evelyn's remains were placed in a recent burial. Can you imagine having to dig up fresh graves looking for a missing girl? Oh, gross. And poor kid. In May of 1954, mass lie detector tests were conducted on La Crosse area high school boys in an attempt to find more information about Evelyn's disappearance. though local authorities had planned 1,750 students and faculty to be tested. The testing was controversial and halted after about 300 tests were administered, but that's still a lot of tests. Much later, and after his arrest for other things, Ed Gein was considered a suspect in Evelyn's disappearance. It's said he was visiting a relative a few blocks away from the Rasmussen house at the time. Y'all, law enforcement can't have it both ways. Did he travel or didn't he? With him being a babysitter himself, would he have left the baby unsupervised? It does bring up a lot of further questions, and maybe they were just trying to close a case and pin it on somebody they always knew was guilty of something. Gein had denied any involvement in the disappearance and passed 2 lie detector tests. They were leaning kind of heavily on those lie detectors, weren't they? But police found no trace of Evelyn's remains during the search of Gein's Plainfield property. In November 1957, authorities announced that Ed Gein had been cleared of any connection with the disappearance of both Evelyn and Georgia Weckler. Despite this, some still consider Gein a suspect, and this was the days before DNA, and honestly, Sugar, the reliability of a lie detector test, especially those conducted in the 50s, remains a subject of great debate. But I'm still not sure we can pin this one on Ed, considering that an eyewitness said that there were 2 people, but we also know that eyewitnesses aren't always the most reliable either. Evelyn's abduction led to one of the biggest searches in the history of Wisconsin. A reward fund established in the immediate aftermath of the event reached $6,600. That's the equivalent of about $78,000. Yeah, it's a lot of money, especially, back then times were different. Folks were desperate to bring that girl home, too. In 2004, we're going to skip ahead so I can finish this part of the story. A man named Mel Williams came forward with a conversation he recorded at a bar in 1969. Although his goal was to record a band that was performing at that bar at that time, the conversation between the 2 men was unintentionally recorded as well. On the tape, one of the men, Clyde, or Twy Peterson, as he was known, implicated himself, Jack Gulfair, and an unnamed third party in the disappearance, claiming that Evelyn was murdered and buried in Lafarge, Wisconsin after her kidnapping. That unnamed party is now deceased. Gulfair committed suicide on December 25, 1967, and Peterson died of a heart attack in 1974. Although the authorities promised to investigate the lead, no further developments ever made because apparently some secrets die with the people that kept them. In December 1954, Plainfield Tavern owner Mary Hogan, with whom Ed had been obsessed, well, he started trying to ask her out and flirt in his own little weirdo way. Well, she disappeared from her establishment. Investigators suspected foul play because of obvious reasons. There was blood on the floor next to an empty bullet casing. Ed later revealed that he had been hanging out with her, they'd been drinking a little bit. Then he pulled the blinds down, put a .22 caliber gun to her forehead, and shot her. The next day, the day after the murder, while working with Elmo Uick, a friend of his, he admitted to killing her and said that he had hung her up at his house. Well, Elmo dismissed this statement, not believing him, because ain't Ed just a little bit off anyway? In November of 1957, owner of the local International Harvester product shop and mother of Deputy Frank Warden, Miss Bernice Warden, disappeared from her store. The sheriff and Deputy Warden found the cash register gone, blood on the floor, and a .22 caliber rifle that was out of place on its rack when they arrived at the store. They also found a receipt for antifreeze made out to Ed Gein. That had been the last sale of the day. So Ed, by leaving that scrap of paper there, had basically signed his name to the crime. The next day, the sheriff, and deputy warden. Now, I got questions about this. Today, that deputy probably wouldn't have been allowed to go search for his mother's body, but times were different back in the day. And they entered Ed's house through the shed or summer kitchen. Bernice Warden's headless corpse was found hanging upside down with her ankles lashed to a crossbeam. She was split open from personal area to her sternum and field dressed like a deer. In addition, the police found human skulls affixed to the post of Ed's bed, a box of organs, furniture made out of bone and skin, and masks. Yeah, the masks were the skin portion of the head that had been stripped away from the skull and preserved. Also found was a belt with breasts hanging from it and an entire suit made of pieced-together skin of women, complete with a vest with the boobs attached. Ed had always wanted to please his mother and therefore wanted to become a girl, so that was why he built the skin suit, so he could be a girl like Mama wanted. After remaining silent at first, Ed confessed to killing Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden. He did make another confession, but that was disallowed because apparently one of the deputies, who remained nameless, had beat the confession out of him, and I don't think we have to take too many guesses at who that deputy was. But the autopsy report could tell a cold, hard clinical truth. Mrs. Warden had died of a single gunshot to the back of her head. Quick and merciful considering what came after. When asked about the murder and mutilation, Ed offered nothing more than his own little explanation. His quote, "I was sort of in a daze like." That was all he said. As if evil itself had settled over him like fog. The search of that accursed 195-acre farm began and stretched for over a week, each day revealing more horrors buried in Wisconsin soil. On November 21st, lie detector test results were released to the press like a death knell. 2 days later, Ed was dragged before a judge, technically charged with robbery. The murder charge was held back while they determined if his mind had completely snapped. The psychiatrist and psychologist who interviewed him declared that what everyone already knew in their bones, that he was schizophrenic and a sexual psychopath. Now, the reason they would hold him back, the murder charge, well, they got to see if he's competent to stand trial, but charging him with robbery gave them reason to hold him and not let him out while these tests were conducted. So there was method in their madness, and I totally approved that. On November 24th, they opened the graves Ed had supposedly robbed, and, Lord help, Mrs. Adams' grave was found empty. Yeah. By the 29th, deputies had unearthed more bones buried in the trenches on Ed's farm, one skull bearing a gold tooth, believed to belong to a man. So maybe women weren't his only targets, and we're looking back to those two guys that went missing under very suspicious circumstance. But the house itself, hun, that would haunt the dreams of every soul who crossed its threshold. The dwelling was... how do you even explain something so horrible? The house didn't have any electricity, so they were in there, the police was in there, searching with lanterns and flashlights. Years of neglect had transformed that home into a barely standing shed, and it was totally decayed, and the smell was pretty horrific. Can you imagine trying to search through that mess in the dark? The two rooms that had not been boarded up were just overflowing, and it looked like the worst kind of hoarder lived there. Mountains of books, yellow, decaying papers, rusty utensils. It seemed like he had gone the opposite of taking out the trash. He just collected stuff. And there was boxes of stuff laying around and stuff laying all over the floor. But it was in Augusta's bedroom and sitting room that had been boarded up tight as a coffin that held some real trippy shit. Those rooms stayed exactly like they were the day she kicked off. Her dresses were still hanging in the closet like funeral shrouds. Her Bible was still open to whatever hellfire and brimstone passage she'd been reading when the stroke took her. Her bed was made up tight enough to bounce a quarter off. Ed had turned those rooms into some sort of twisted shrine, and visiting them, he was praying to her as a saint. But those poor investigators and what they found scattered around the rest of that godforsaken house was right out of Satan's own fever dream. Human remains turned into some of the sickest decor you'd ever want to see, and they didn't want to see it. Nobody wants to see that stuff, but they had a job to do, and they got on with it. Complete skeletons were just laying around like broken toys, bones all yellow and nasty from sitting there for years. There was a wastebasket made from human skin. I mean, who the hell does that? Well, Ed Gein does that. Chair seats were covered in people hide. Yeah, now it's a Southern expression when you're in trouble with your parents that they gonna tan your hide. Well, Ed wasn't even Southern, but he took that expression and just ran with it. There were skulls sitting on his bedpost like the world's most fucked up trophies, and some female skulls that had been hollowed out into kind of a bowl-shaped thing for God knows what. So I guess some of those teenage rumors might have been, a touch of truth. He'd made himself a corset out of some poor woman's torso. A lady who used to laugh and love and have a family. There were leggings made from human leg skin hung in his closet. And masks made out of women's faces, and they seemed like they stared at you, even though the eye holes were empty. In a regular old paper bag, like the kind you'd pack your lunch in, was Mary Hogan's face, just sitting there waiting for Ed to play his sick little games. Her skull was found in a cardboard box nearby. Mary Warden's whole head was wrapped up in burlap like some nightmare Christmas present. Sitting right next to it was her heart that Ed had wrapped up and sit by his little pot-bellied stove. He was going to cook it and eat it later. Now, the next part, I don't even know how to tell y'all this other than to tell you directly what I found. There were 9 vulvas in a shoebox, arranged like he was collecting some sort of baseball cards or something. There was a child's dress next to the private parts, and a couple of them appeared to be from about 15, 16-year-old girls. Now, that puts the suspicion of Evelyn's disappearance back on him. These were kids that should have been more worried about prom dates and homework, not ending up as souvenirs for this sick little bastard. He had a belt made of women's nipples, like some sort of twisted charm bracelet. Also found there were 4 noses, some lips sewn onto a window pull cord, yeah, like party decorations, a lampshade made from somebody's face. There were mason jars full of fingernails that he'd collected from the dead women's hands. Well, the crime lab assures us that once they had photographed everything, they respectfully cremated the remains and promised that they did something respectful with it. And I want to forever think that we can take them at their word. But taking those pictures and seeing those images, you're never going to get rid of that. You can't burn that out of your brain. So I'm going to go through the timeline of this next little bit. And if you're counting, if you're crocheting along with me, yeah, I don't want to mess up your count, so I'm just warning you ahead of time. December 9th, 1957, Ed starts whining about memory problems when the doctor wants to interview him. That's real convenient, don't y'all think? And I'm still thinking he's not as dumb as he put up being. December 12th, so this a few days later, the doctor says Ed's got an abnormally magnified attachment to his mother. No shit, that didn't take Sherlock, did it? 5 days later, judge gets the paperwork saying that Ed's nuttier than fruitcake and needs to be locked up for good. In January 6th of 58, they declare Ed legally insane and ship him back to the hospital. March 20th of 58, Ed's farm is supposed to be auctioned off, but oopsie doodles. A mysterious fire burns the whole damn thing to the ground. Funny how nobody could get out there to put the fire out. Well, they got there in plenty of time to deal with that brush fire, but, well, things happen. When Ed found out that his childhood home and the whole farmstead had burned down, you know what he said? He just shrugged his shoulders and said, just as well. 10 years later, in January 22nd, 1968, he'd been in the hospital for 10 years, and you know what his favorite thing was? Arts and crafts. Yeah, oh, that gives me the chills. And apparently he played nice with everybody. But they had decided that Ed was sane enough to go to trial. Here's what the doctors had figured out about Ed. That crazy sumbitch loved his mother, but hated her guts at the same time. She'd messed him up so bad that he never grew past the emotional age of about 12 years old. He saw people as playthings. Yeah, they were just there to be toyed with. Ed used to giggle over the medical books with all their naked pictures and that warning on the front. You can do nothing to bring the dead to life, but you can do much to save the living from death. Yeah, that's the book he was reading. My goodness. So the head doctor said cutting up women and keeping pieces of them scratched 2 itches at once, bringing Mama back and destroying the bitch that ruined his life. November 7th, 1968, the trial starts and lasts only 1 week. They find Ed guilty of murder, but he's not sane enough to fry him, so they took him back to the hospital. In February of 1974, Ed files papers saying that he feels all better now. Yeah, right. By June, the judge that was in charge of this says, hell no, you're not getting out. 1978, they move Ed to a different hospital where he sits around all day and plays checkers and acts like butter wouldn't melt. Now get this, some greedy developer wanted to turn Ed's farmland into a tourist trap. The good people said, literally said this, over our dead bodies. And that place remained vacant for another few years. The people of Plainfield did not want to be known for this. July 26, 1984, Ed Gein dies from cancer at the age of 78. He's senile, pathetic, skinny, scrawny, yeah. And the crazy thing, everyone at the hospital thought he was just a sweet old man who made arts and crafts and shared them with other patients. I wonder, just my morbid curiosity, I wonder how collectible they are now. The very next day, July 27th, 1984, they bury Ed next to his mama at 6 in the morning. I don't know why they want to do that, but okay. Had to be a secret, I suppose. Yeah, some other people could have made that even more ugly and gruesome than it already was. Only 4 people were there. And it originally had a headstone, but people kept vandalizing it, so there's no marker on his grave. But if you go to find a grave and look up Ed Gein, it's not a stretch to know where he's buried. He's right next to his mother, and in between her and his brother. There's no headstone there, but it's pretty obvious. The headstone was put in storage because people kept taking chips off of it and stuff. You know, that's bad juju. I wish people would just not do that. Today that farm is just an empty field, but people say that weird shit happens there. They can hear screaming, like in the wind. Ed's ghost is wandering around. Bad vibes, just a ugly bad feeling that make you want to run away. Some paranormal guy brought some psychics out there without telling them why or where, and they wouldn't even get out of the car. One said the place felt like a wound in the earth that will never heal. I hope they get everybody from every major religion to go out there and bless that and purify it and do what they can. Yeah, it's a bad spot on Mother Earth, and I hope they can do something to eventually cleanse it. Once Ed something that just gives me creeps, and like this whole story don't give me creeps. He says When I see a pretty girl walking down the street, I think two things. One part of me wants to take her out, talk to her, and be real sweet and nice. The other part of me wonders what her head would look like on a stick. End quote. So that's where I'm going to leave Ed Gein, lying in place next to the woman who made him a monster, in a grave that no longer anybody seems to care about. And that's it for me this week. Sweet dreams, y'all. Maybe check on those locks one more time before bed. So sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that learn to say please and thank you and fit in, even if a little bit weirdly, into our regular community. I'm not saying point a finger at the weirdo every time something happens, but be careful who you trust too much. Sweet dreams. Till next time. Good night, y'all.